I have a thought that I wanted to share, and we'll probably end the power hour a little bit earlier than usual today, but going to share something. Hopefully, it's clear in its current form. And this is, I'd put this topic as how to think about byproducts. And this is a very valuable skill to have in every area of life, and certainly when thinking about energy. Now, let me put this a little bit in context. The core of what I call the moral case for fossil fuels is that we need to look at energy issues and really all issues and the energy decisions that we face from a human flourishing perspective. And first, when I say energy decisions we face as personally, professionally, and particularly politically, we face all these different decisions about what forms of energy should we and other people use in the future. Politically, there are these global things like Paris Climate Accords. Nationally, these things like fracking, 100% renewable. Locally, similar kinds of things. And then professionally, there are things like, okay, do we invest in a sustainable fund? Does our company try to go 100% renewable? Do we buy renewable energy credits? And then personally, there are things like, do we use solar panels? Do we buy a Tesla? All of these different kinds of things. So there are just all sorts of different energy decisions that people are making. And the general idea is that a good energy decision, this is the prevailing idea, the good energy decision is one that is anti-fossil fuels. So if you do anything that moves you or your company or the world away from fossil fuels, then you've done a good thing. And the premise of my work is no, that's not at all how you want to. And often they'll think in toward renewable energy, so particularly toward solar and wind. And my premise is no, I don't think of it that way at all. I think of it in terms of human flourishing. So if you're making an energy decision that's helping you flourish, or people in your country flourish, or people in the world flourish more, and hopefully those can generally be in harmony, then that's a good kind of decision to make. And it doesn't matter, if it comes from coal or if it comes from a solar panel. The thing is really you want to be looking at, okay, what's good for human flourishing? And so that raises the issue of how do you know what's good for human flourishing? And this leads to the concept of full impact or overall impact, which is that if you're looking at, let's just say, an energy choice, like, okay, India is using a certain kind of energy, you want to look at, okay, what's the overall impact of that on people's lives? And I find it easiest to think of it this way. First, from an individual perspective. So if you imagine we're all producing our own energy, you think of, okay, what in my home would have the best overall impact on my life? And then you can divide that into product and byproduct. So if you're choosing a form of energy, there's the product, which is the energy, hopefully abundant and reliable, for that helps you with all sorts of different things in life. So that's the product of it. But then the process that produces the product is always going to have some sort of byproduct. And then that can be waste, that can be a side effect, like a certain amount of air emissions in your home, if we're thinking about your home, and it can be risk, a certain chance of the thing exploding. And so when we talk about full impact or overall impact, it's thinking about, okay, what's the sum total that I'm getting? What's the benefit of the product plus what's the impact of the byproduct? But the byproduct is important, can have a positive and negative impact. So you can think of it as product minus negative byproducts plus positive byproducts. And it's important to think of all of these. And it's important to think of all of these with precision. And the general observation I make is that people tend to dramatically undervalue the product of abundant, reliable energy, which is the ultimate kind of product because it gives you increased capability to make everything in your life better. And then they tend to dramatically exaggerate the byproducts of things, including treating them as all negative. So I've been thinking about, okay, how do you help people think better about these calculations? And I thought, okay, well, there are at least 4 principles of byproducts that are really, really helpful in thinking about what's a good decision. And so here are the 4. One is that byproducts always have safe levels above zero. Byproducts always have safe levels above zero. So this is the idea that for any given substance in the world, even I think anthrax, there's some level above zero where you're still safe. Unfortunately, anthrax is not a byproduct of stuff, but it's important because you're always going to have some level of byproduct. And it's important that some level doesn't mean danger. And sometimes it's literally nothing that can happen to you with a certain quantity. And then in the case of a risk, there's no such thing as zero risk, but you can just talk about it as like a standard background risk. There's just a certain amount of risk that we have in our lives. And the idea is with any given thing, you can get that risk down so that it's just the standard background risk. So it's not a meaningful risk to your life. But it's really important when dealing with byproducts, because if you don't know that they always have safe levels above zero, then you're going to have this fanaticism with getting them to zero. And then you're going to be willing to pay a lot of cost for that, and then that's going to lead to be a problem, which is going to be a point I bring up in a minute. So that's one. Byproducts can always have safe levels above zero, and now part of that is there are always dangerous levels above zero as well. But I want to emphasize they always have safe levels above zero. Principle two, and these aren't necessarily in any final order, but is that byproducts can be positive. This is really important. So if we take something like CO2 is a byproduct of fossil fuel emissions, and for sure in some cases it can be positive. That is, there are a lot of plants in the world that are beneficial to us that are growing more because of more CO2. Now, there are probably plants that are not beneficial to us that are growing because of more CO2. I have seen nothing to indicate that those in any way match the beneficial plants, but nevertheless, you have to look at all of them. And then you can talk about, okay, warming from CO2, that could be positive and that could also be negative. And so the point here is not in any given case that the positives outweigh the negatives. Usually with most byproducts at a given time, the negatives outweigh the positives. That's sort of why you think of them as byproducts. But nevertheless, it's important that they can be positive. You're not going to do a good full impact analysis or overall impact analysis if you don't recognize and look for positive byproducts. A third principle is that byproducts can often be neutralized. This is a really important one. So if you take the example of coal, and I mentioned this in an earlier segment, coal is a broad term and coal technology is a broad term, but there are modern, and so you can think of it as, well, when you just burn coal straight, particularly lignite, which is the least pure form of coal, when you burn that, then you create a whole bunch of air emissions of different kind of plant things that were in the lignite that you don't want to be exposed to in large concentrations. Although in some concentrations, they're okay. That goes back to byproducts always have safe levels above zero. So you can think of coal as, oh yeah, I'm just burning a bunch of lignite in my home. But really, the technology that exists around coal can help you neutralize those byproducts or those potential byproducts. And you can do that in a number of ways. Sometimes you can purify the raw materials. So you could purify the lignite. And of course, you could also just use a different form of coal sometimes. And then you can burn it. You could burn it more cleanly. You can filter it. You can do all sorts of different things. But the key is that a given technology involving a certain kind of substance that people are concerned about, often you can neutralize the byproducts. And that's a really cool phenomenon. And we always want to be aware of that, because when you think about, hey, should I use coal or not? You want to be aware of, oh, there may be a way to neutralize these byproducts that we associate with coal, and therefore I can get a whole bunch of benefit and much lower or even none of the byproduct at a level that I'd be concerned about. Another thing that's related to neutralizing byproducts is you can actually, this is an advanced form of neutralizing, you can actually transform them into wealth. So with, say, oil used to have all these byproducts, and then refiners, the byproducts, you dump them into a lake, and then the byproducts, we can now actually turn them into wealth. So if you have a whole barrel of oil, people find value out of every aspect of the barrel. So instead of going into a lake and being a negative byproduct, it becomes a positive byproduct. And now people even think of like the different things, I guess sometimes the sulfur, but definitely things like tar in a barrel of oil. Those are actually really beneficial. You can use them for things like roads. So far we have byproducts always have safe levels above zero. They can be positive. They can often be neutralized. And then the last one is the one I'm probably most associated with, which is that byproducts can often be offset or overwhelmed by the benefits of the product. Byproducts can often be offset or even overwhelmed by the benefits of the product. So this is the phenomenon that I talk about, say, with the issue of climate, where if you think about, okay, having a certain amount of more CO2 in the atmosphere, that leads to a certain amount of warming, and then that can have certain climate impacts, and some of those can be negative. But the benefits that came with that byproduct, which is people having a lot more energy than they than they otherwise would, because for billions and billions of people, some form of fossil fuel energy solution is it's either the most affordable or sometimes it's the only affordable way of accomplishing their goals. Like with, say, air travel, it's the only affordable way of accomplishing your goals. And so all the extra energy that comes with that CO2 has overwhelming benefits, not just in the rest of people's lives, but even specifically in the realm of climate. It enables us to master climate. It enables us to build a very climate resilient civilization, which is why deaths from climate related causes keep going down and down and down, because we've effectively mastered climate, and we've not only offset man-made climate danger if it exists, but we've offset and overwhelmed a huge amount of natural climate danger. And then on top of that, we've offset and overwhelmed a natural amount of other danger in life, which is why our lives are so much longer now and so much more prosperous than they were. So byproducts can often be offset or overwhelmed by the benefits of the product. So if we keep this in mind and we're thinking about decisions, whether we're thinking about our own or national or global, it's good to have in mind this idea of, okay, what I want really is I want the best overall impact for the price. When I'm making an energy decision, I want the best overall impact for the price, with the proviso that overall impact means product and byproduct. Best means human flourishing. And then when we're thinking about the byproducts, we have to be aware of these four things at least, so that the byproducts can always have safe levels above zero. So don't treat the byproduct as necessarily toxic in any quantity. The byproducts can be positive, or some can. Byproducts can often be neutralized, and then the byproducts can often be offset or overwhelmed by the benefits of the product. So applying this to the globe, if you think of the world you think of the map of the world, and then you think about the question, what is the best source of energy for all of these people around the world? It's helpful to think of it this way. And I think of fossil fuels as having these three attributes that you need to be aware of, and how they compare to others. And so one attribute, and the core attribute, is resource efficiency. And so that is how much energy can they generate with how few resources. And then it turns out, for most people most of the time, and for a lot of people all of the time, uh, some form of fossil fuel solution is going to be by far the most resource efficient thing. So if you look around, if you think of the whole world as a map, you think of it as, okay, most of the time, fossil fuels are the most resource efficient. Not all of the time, because sometimes maybe hydro in Washington State will be good. And you can imagine solar off grid will be good sometimes. But in general, it's going to be some form of hydrocarbon is the most resource efficient thing, which is going to mean more people on the map have more access to more energy than they otherwise would. So that's one piece of the puzzle. And then the next piece of the puzzle is the CO2. So because there's CO2 that comes along with it. And although byproducts can often be neutralized, we don't have right now cost-effective ways of doing that for CO2. So the CO2, a lot of CO2 is going to come along with using these fossil fuels. But then if we evaluate them, we see that they either are at a safe level, or they're at least at a safe enough level to be completely offset and overwhelmed by the benefits. So then the implication of that is, really, CO2 at this point shouldn't change anyone's energy choices, because in all of the cases, I think the benefits far outweigh the negatives. Now, it's an interesting question. If CO2 was more of an issue, then what would you do? And that's a whole subject. I think in general, you'd focus a lot on climate mastery and on cost-effective alternatives like nuclear. But this is my current assessment, is that CO2 shouldn't change anyone's calculations. But then if you look at the other byproducts, I think sometimes those do change people's calculations. And you look at, say, situations in China and India, and what are they doing? Well, right now they're using a lot of hydrocarbons, mostly in the form of coal. And I think it's quite probable that the best solution for them is to use a cleaner version of coal. So to use higher quality coal, to use different kinds of purification technologies, to use better burning technologies, to use better filtering technologies. Because if you look at product plus byproduct, they, in some cases, are generating a level of byproduct that's definitely quite far from ideal and can make life quite uncomfortable. And clean air is a very important aspect of human flourishing. So if you think of the map, It might be that coal is still on their part of the map, but that's too general because it's a cleaner form of coal. And then that way, that might add a little bit of cost, but then it might add a lot of benefit in terms of cleaner air. But we have to be really careful because we don't want to, the more, the less affordable we make energy, the more we're depriving people of all these kinds of benefits. So this is why you have to think of this kind of thing very, very carefully. But going back to byproducts can often be neutralized. One aspect of that is sometimes byproducts can be neutralized in a cost-effective or even profitable way. So with, say, making oil cleaner has actually been profitable. And it may be that I've heard of certain coal technologies like desulfurizing technologies that may be profitable because then you can sell the sulfur for agriculture. So the idea here is when you're making these decisions, you want to think about what is the decision with the best overall impact on primarily the people making it. Now, when we talk about global things, there are certain potential conflicts of interest, and that's a subject for another day. Uh, but in general, you want to just, particularly if you're thinking on a country level, where those people are dealing with the side effects and byproducts of the energy that they're benefiting from, you really want to think about, okay, what's the overall impact on their lives? And what's the solution with the best combination of product and byproduct? And it's not that the solution is to have no byproduct, but it's to have a level of byproduct. And when you add that with the product, it leads to the best possible outcome. And one more time, you always need to be aware that byproducts always have safe levels above zero, that they can be positive, that they can often be neutralized, and they can often be offset or overwhelmed by the benefits of the product. And I think if people think this way, if they do this really good, accurate type of analysis, then they'll be really excited about how different kinds of hydrocarbons, including coal, can make a lot of people's lives a lot better. And then how depriving people of those different kinds of hydrocarbon options, including the cleaner ones, will make their lives much, much worse. So that is my thought for the day. Any comments from either of you on that?
Yeah, so I just had a thought. So you mentioned that byproducts can be beneficial, and if you think about air pollutants, there's often a situation where actually a little bit of sort of dirty air could be beneficial in the sense that if you have too clean an air, your bodily immune system cannot adapt to that, and so you can have too clean air. So a little bit of sort of air pollution might actually be beneficial to us.
Yeah, this came up in Robert Phelan's book, and the idea is that if you're in a situation where you're inevitably going to be exposed to some kind of level of contaminants in the air, which just happens in nature all the time, then it's actually very dangerous to artificially seal yourself off from anything like that, because then your natural defenses go down, and there's kind of an equivalent of with the people who are deprived of any kind of dirt early in life having these much weaker immune systems, or people who aren't working out at all, who aren't stressing their muscles, how that weakens their muscles and their bones. Don, any thoughts from you before we wrap up?
I mean, it reinforces to me the importance about thinking in terms of an ultimate goal of human flourishing, because then it's very easy to just focus maniacally on something like clean. Like clean sounds like that's pretty good, but then you think, all right, well, what we're really concerned with is health and safety. But even those, like to even understand what health and safety are and whether that's something that you're optimizing for, you need to know like what is our ultimate goal. And that includes things like we need energy, we need prosperity, and that there's just no way to think clearly about these things and make proper trade-offs if you don't have in mind an ultimate goal. You're inevitably going to optimize for the wrong thing, and it might be something that's legitimate like health and safety, or it could be something illegitimate like just clean as an end in itself.
And one addition to that is that when I'm thinking of different kinds of areas of concern with byproducts, so health being a big one, maybe the biggest one that comes up, I find it essential to always be clear on what is the aspect of human flourishing that I'm concerned with. And it's almost always misdefined by the popular discussion. So, for example, you mentioned clean. So, if we're talking about air, I'm working on this section of the book on air emissions. When people talk about air, they usually talk about zero emissions air as the ideal, or natural air as the ideal. And both of those are just wrong for reasons Stefan mentioned. The goal is not zero emissions, because if there's such a thing as air being too clean and then natural, well, you can have natural air from a volcano, and that's really bad. So what you want is healthy air, and then that means concentrations of different molecules and compounds that are consistent with your health. And then, Don, as you mentioned, you have to integrate that into a broader context of human flourishing, because there are other things that you care about besides your air quality. But specifically with the air quality, you need to think about, okay, what is air quality? What's a standard of air quality that's a human flourishing standard versus what's the standard of air quality that's a green version? Because usually you have this green zero impact version of everything. The same thing with water. Like, okay, you want healthy water, high quality water, drinking water. You don't want green water, right? You don't want unimpacted water. I mean, you certainly don't want that. And so this comes up with safety. Like, you don't want natural levels of safety, nor do you want like perfect safety or something like that. That's not a valid concept anyway. But you want to always think about human flourishing as the ultimate thing, and then what's the aspect of human flourishing that I'm considering right now. Another one would be, we want a livable climate. We don't want an unchanged climate. And everyone right now is obsessed with an unchanged climate, and they're willing to sacrifice a livable climate and then a livable life to an unchanged climate. So thinking about the core idea is, we're always looking at, okay, what has the best overall impact on human flourishing? And that includes, okay, for the price, overall impact is product and byproduct, and then best means human flourishing. Hope that helps, and look forward to writing a lot more about that in the new moral case for fossil fuels.